Valley Crucis, an 800-year-old abbey near the town of Llangollen in western Britain, close to the border between England and Wales. Within these cloistered walls, during the Middle Ages, the very oldest stories of King Arthur were preserved. They were painstakingly copied by monks working night and day into manuscripts that still survive. These earliest Arthurian accounts were originally composed during the Dark Ages, a period of turmoil when civilization crumbled following the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century. Remarkably, these ancient works depict Arthur as an historical figure who lived around the year 500 AD. But unlike the later medieval tales, which portray him as a king in shining armour living in a huge Gothic castle, Arthur is revealed to have been a post-Roman Celtic chieftain, and his fortifications would have been earthen embankments and wooden stockades. Valley Crucis held a further secret concerning the historical King Arthur and his times. During the Dark Ages, Britain was divided into separate kingdoms, and an inscription on this 1200-year-old pillar close to the abbey reveals which one of them King Arthur ruled. A 9th century inscription on the pillar of Eliseg in eastern Wales reveals that this area had once been ruled by a king named Vortigern, and in the Arthurian story, Vortigern is a direct predecessor of King Arthur. 1500 years ago, when Arthur is said to have lived, Britain was divided into separate feuding kingdoms. The pillar stands in what had been the kingdom of Powys in the heart of the country, and its capital was the old Roman city of Viraconium, the principal city of all Britain during the 5th century. Its ruins still survive in fields just outside the village of Wroxeter in the county of Shropshire. If Vortigern had ruled from here in the late 400s, then so presumably had his successors, one of which, according to legend, was King Arthur himself. Recent archaeological excavations have revealed that around the year 500 AD, Viraconium was massively refortified. But these new defences were not the grandiose stone fortifications of the Roman era, but the more practical wooden stockades of the post-Roman period. However, a magnificent stone building was constructed at the heart of the city. Archaeologists determined that it was the residence of the powerful king who ruled here around the year 500. Could this have been the historical King Arthur? This ancient royal palace was not a cold Gothic castle of the later Middle Ages, but a lavish, luxurious Roman-style villa. So, are these the ruins of the historical Camelot? Nestling amongst the misty hills to the west of Viraconium is Lake Bala. Here, on its wind-swept banks, there stood an ancient monastic community of simple stone huts, and in one of them, in the mid-600s, there lived a reclusive poet. His name was Laiwach, and he wrote a poetic saga concerning the early kings of Powys, whose capital was at Viraconium. Remarkably, this work still survives at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Called The Song of Laiwach the Old, This 1400-year-old saga contains one of the oldest surviving references to King Arthur, and it tells us that Arthur was indeed a king of Powys. Viraconium is the most historically feasible site from which the legend of Camelot arose. It was the largest, most sophisticated and most heavily defended city archaeology has yet uncovered anywhere in Britain from the period Arthur is said to have lived, and the Pillar of Eliseg and the Song of Laiwach the Old imply that centuries before the Arthurian story we know today was compiled, Arthur was thought to have ruled from here. The Holy Grail. One sip from it, it is said, can cure all ills. Legend tells how after the crucifixion, it was the cup used by one of the disciples to collect a few drops of Christ's blood. The legends disagree as to which follower of Jesus this was, some saying it was Joseph of Arimathea, others that it was Mary Magdalene. During the Middle Ages, tales were written of how the early followers of Jesus brought the Holy Grail to Britain, where it was later sought by the knights of King Arthur. It is eventually found by Sir Percival, who sees it being held by a beautiful maiden during a banquet at a mysterious castle. The place is referred to only as the White Castle in the White Town, and such a place does exist. This is the White Castle in the town of Whittington, and the name Whittington comes from early English meaning literally White Town. The ruins of Viraconium, which my research suggests was the historical Camelot, lie just a few miles to the southeast of Whittington. Remarkably, the Fitzwarreens, a family that lived here during the Middle Ages, actually claimed to have possessed the Grail. It was said that they kept it in the castle chapel. Its ruins still survive. An ancient relic believed to be the Holy Grail may well have been kept here during the Middle Ages. It certainly seems to have been the location of the Grail Castle that the medieval writers had in mind. But Whittington Castle was only built in the 12th century, over 600 years after the time that Arthur is said to have lived. But nearby there is a fortification called Dinas Bran that is very much older. What remains of its ancient, weathered, grey stone walls stand on top of a 1,000-foot, steep-sided hill, looking out onto the mountains of Wales. During the period in which the earliest accounts set King Arthur's life, 1,500 years ago, this was the site of a Dark Age hill fort. It would have been a Roman-style fortification, surrounded by a series of defensive ditches and embankments. Although this was not a castle in the medieval sense, it seems to have been here that the story of the Grail Castle originated. In the medieval Arthurian romance, Percival is shown the Grail by a maiden, accompanied by a young man holding a spear from which drips blood. A much earlier Dark Age Arthurian tale has a Welsh hero called Peredur witnessing an almost identical scene. And in this narrative, the story is set here, at Dinas Bran. The fort is named after a mythological Celtic hero called Bran, who is thought to have lived here and was said to be the guardian of a number of mystical relics. In the Arthurian saga, a very similar sounding Bronn is said to be the guardian of the Grail. So it's just possible that an object believed to have been the Holy Grail was kept here during the period Arthur is said to have lived, and later moved to the White Castle at Whittington, where it became incorporated into the ever-evolving romance of King Arthur. Where did King Arthur eventually fall in battle? An ancient manuscript preserved in the British Library contains the oldest reference to King Arthur's death. The 10th century Welsh Annals tells us that he died at the Battle of Camlan. But where exactly Camlan was has remained an enduring mystery. Archaeological excavations at the ruins of Viraconium in central Britain now suggest that it was the principal city in the entire country at the time Arthur is said to have lived. So was Arthur's last battle thought to have been fought here, or perhaps somewhere nearby? 1500 years ago, Britain was divided into separate kingdoms, the largest of which was Powys, and Viraconium was the capital of Powys. The king who ruled from here around 500 AD is a good candidate for an historical Arthur. A British monk named Gildas, writing within living memory of this period, refers to this king under the Latin name Ursus, which means the bear. Many rulers of the period were given the honorific title or battle name of an animal, and astonishingly in Brythonic, the language spoken by the Britons at the time and still preserved in modern Welsh, the word for a bear is Arth, a name that could quite easily have evolved into the more lyrical Arthur. At the very least, that a man called Arth ruled from the capital of Britain at exactly the time that King Arthur is said to have done just that is surely more than coincidence. So how did this warrior known as the Bear actually die? Well, remarkably, under almost exactly the same circumstances as King Arthur. According to the Arthurian story, a rebellion is mounted by Arthur's treacherous nephew, Mordred. The revolt leads to the Battle of Camlan, in which Mordred inflicts Arthur with a fatal wound. The birth name of the king of Powys, Gildas refers to as the Bear, was Owain. And Owain, who seems to have been the historical King Arthur, was killed by his nephew, Maglacunus. Whereas Arth meant bear, Maglacunus meant great hound, seemingly another title. The oldest surviving reference to the Battle of Camlan names Arthur's opponent as Medrawd. This, it would seem, was the birth name of Maglacunus, from where the name and legend of Mordred ultimately derived. Owain, the historical Arthur, ruled from Viraconium in the kingdom of Powys, leaving his nephew, Maglacunus, the historical Mordred, to govern the adjacent kingdom of Gwynedd from the citadel of Caer the Ganway. The village of de Ganway stands at the mouth of the River Conway on the north coast of Wales. Rising 400 feet above the modern town is the remains of an ancient volcano. On top of these grey stone cliffs, there once stood a well-defended fortress. Called Caer Diganway Stronghold in English, some of its ruined walls can still be seen today. 1500 years ago, this was the seat of the chieftain known as the Great Hound, Maglacunas in Latin, or Maelgwyn in Welsh. In the early 6th century, it seems that Maglacunas set out from here at the head of his army in an attempt to overthrow his uncle Owain and make himself High King of the Britons. According to the monk Gildas, Maglacunas overthrew his uncle in a battle, and the most likely site for this battle, according to military historians, is at a place called Forden. Here there stood a fort on the borders between Gwynedd and Powys. The site of the fort stands on high ground, overlooking what is now a tranquil valley. But 1500 years ago, it is thought that this is where the battle between Owain and Maglacunas actually occurred. The oldest surviving work to provide any details concerning Arthur's last battle is found in the Red Book of Hergest, a medieval manuscript preserved at Oxford's Bodleian Library. It contains the 12th century tale The Dream of Rhonabwy. It was written in Old Welsh, but in English translation we can see that it refers to the Battle of Camlan between Arthur and his nephew Medrawd, the Welsh for Mordred. It actually tells us where the battle was fought, at a place called Rhai Gros. Remarkably, the likely site of the battle between Owain and Maglacunas bears this very name. Rhai Gros is the name of the farmland. This busy road was once a cart track running south from the fort at Forden to cross a river at what is now Shire Grove Bridge. Rhai Gros means Ford of the Cross, and a ford is a river crossing. It seems that this area got its name from a ford that was once here at the place where the bridge crosses the river. The Dream of Rhonabwy actually tells us that Arthur was positioned during the battle just below this ford. It would seem, therefore, that on the map, Arthur was somewhere here. Evidently, whereas Arthur's army was encamped in the hill fort, Arthur himself led a contingent that was holding the ford. Perhaps the most compelling evidence that this was indeed where the Battle of Camlan was fought is in the name of this winding little river. It is called the River Camlad, a remarkably similar name to Camlan. When all the evidence is considered, it would appear to be here that the historical King Arthur ultimately fell. According to legend, when King Arthur died, he was taken across the water to be buried on the mystical Isle of Avalon. My research suggests that the historical King Arthur was a man named Owain, a warrior who ruled Britain around 500 AD. His title was the Bear, which in ancient British was Arth. So where was he laid to rest? Was it on a sacred island? Around 500 AD, Britain was being invaded by the Anglo-Saxons. From their homeland in northern Germany, they sailed across to Britain to seize control of the southeast, including London, leaving the central city of Viraconium as the new capital of the native Britons. The ruins of Viraconium still survive, and it is from here that Owain ruled, uniting the separate British kingdoms to fight the Anglo-Saxons. But when he died, British unity died with him. Throughout the 6th and early 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons continued their advance, conquering most of what is now England, pushing the Britons into what is now Wales. By this time, Viraconium was merely the capital of the Kingdom of Powys. But in 658, the Anglo-Saxons overran eastern Powys and seized Viraconium. And during the attack on the city, the last British king to rule from here was killed. Fortunately, one member of the royal family, the king's sister, Princess Helith, managed to escape. She eventually settled in the British Kingdom of Gwent, in a place now called Llanhilleth. Here she founded a priory, where an ancient church still stands today. After her death, she was proclaimed a saint, and the area, Llanhilleth, meaning St. Helith, is named after her. While living here as the abbess of the priory, Helith wrote a poem concerning the destruction of Viraconium at the hands of the Anglo-Saxons. Called The Song of Helith, her work still survives in Oxford's Bodleian Library. It refers to the death of Helith's brother, the king, telling us that he is buried at the family burial site, a place where the previous kings of Powys were also laid to rest. Owain, who seems to have been the historical King Arthur, was one of these kings. The poem actually tells us where this burial site was. In the Old British language, it refers to it as Adluisu Bassa, which means the churches of Bassa. Lying just a few miles northwest of Viraconium is a village today called Basschurch. Just outside the village there rises Berth Hill, that archaeologists believe was the original site of the churches of Bassa. In legend, Arthur is said to have been buried on the secret Isle of Avalon. Remarkably, 1500 years ago, Berth Hill was surrounded completely by water. The ancient burial site of the kings of Powys was indeed an island. And recent geophysics surveys have confirmed that early Dark Age graves were dug here. But where in this area might Arthur himself have been laid to rest? Intriguingly, some of the old Arthurian tales tell us that Arthur was only taken to Avalon to be healed, but when he died, he was brought back to shore. This version of events is encapsulated in the most famous Arthurian story, Le Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, by Sir Thomas Malory in the 1400s. Here, Arthur is buried by a group of royal women in a chapel that stood just beside the lake. At Basschurch, a chapel did stand on a spur of high ground that jutted out into the original lake. It was similar to this Celtic church in Ireland, but sadly it was demolished in the 1930s to make way for a road. Here, beside and across the modern B4397, is where the chapel once stood. An ecclesiastical building is recorded here as early as the 8th century. So it is possible that a chapel did stand here during the historical Arthur's time. Nothing now remains to be seen except for a few stones that lie beside the busy road. But experts have determined that some of the original foundation stones bones still survive beneath the ground, and perhaps it is hoped some of the original graves. It is therefore just possible that the lost tomb of King Arthur lies beneath the wheels of these modern cars.